So we've been looking at the Jezebel spirit, and by corollary, we've been looking at the Ahab spirit, which makes her success possible. Now, it's important to remember that demons truly are transgender. We've mentioned this in the past. We're going to take a look at that a little bit tonight. Sometimes men can exhibit the Jezebel spirit, and sometimes women can exhibit the Ahab spirit. Generally speaking, the Jezebel spirit is in women and the Ahab spirit is in men, but there are differences. Now, make no mistake about it, there are only two sexes. The Bible tells us that we're made male and female, anything else is made up. Now, there are true genetic sex abnormalities. Most of these result in spontaneous abortions or miscarriages, and that accounts for about 10 to 15% of all confirmed pregnancies. That number actually surprised me. I didn't know that there were that many miscarriages. There are true hermaphrodites that exhibit characteristics of both sexes. Some females actually have male genes, and some are missing part or all of a gene. Now, these usually cause physical harm. That's why you get the high number of miscarriages. But some of them also cause mental problems, such as Fragile X syndrome, which causes physical, mental, and behavioral problems in people once they are born. And approximately one out of every 400 males and one out of every 650 female births demonstrate some form of sex chromosome abnormality. Some high profile examples of this are Iman Khalif and Lin Yuting, who were Olympic boxers. They were disqualified by the International Boxing Association because they failed gender tests or tests showed that they were male, but they had female characteristics, so the Olympics let them box. So they had male strength, but they were fighting against women. That is one of the abnormalities. Those things happen, but it's not normal. Most of these result in some form of either physical or mental problems or both, not in any sort of gender confusion. They require treatment and care. They're illnesses. Now, this is not what we're talking about when we say transgender. Transgenderism is where someone wants to pretend to be something that they're not, and it involves not only pretending to be the opposite sex, but a whole bunch of other made up genders, plus pretending to be animals and much more bizarre behavior, and it's all demonic. And of course, the United Nations has promoted this and said that you have to accept this because the United Nations is demonic. Now, God created mankind with two gender categories. God created other divine beings who have no bodies, and so they are non gender. They're truly transgender. When they appear, they usually appear as male. However, they sometimes appear as females when they are embodied. Now, we're going to look back at a passage that where we started several weeks ago. Just as a reminder, this is Genesis 6, verses 1 through 4. And it came to pass when men began to multiply on the face of the earth, and daughters were born unto them, that the sons of God saw the daughters of men that they were fair, and they took them wives of all which they chose. And the Lord said, My spirit shall not always strive with man, for that he also is flesh, yet his days shall be 120 years. There were giants in the earth in those days, and also after that, when the sons of God came in unto the daughters of men, and they bare children to them, the same became mighty men, men which were old, men of renown. Now, the demons, who are the spirits of the dead Nephilim, they show up to have sexual relations with both male and female humans, and it's a spectrum that's not limited just to heterosexual liaisons. Also, this omits the question of how the human animal chimeras came to be, which that's not known, and anything is just speculation about it. We know that they existed, and they may still exist. We don't know how they came to be. My personal opinion, based on the evidence, is that it was done with some sort of angel technology, not through any kind of physical liaison on that. But that's just my opinion. Now, God made us in his image, and the fallen angels and the demons want to remake ourselves in their image. If they were to force it on someone, that person would be unaccountable for what they do. But if they can get someone to do it to themselves, they're accountable. Now, if they are to get mankind to remake themselves in the image of the demons, and that image is non-binary and is on a spectrum, that means that the young men must be castrated. Not necessarily literally, could be figuratively, metaphorically speaking, but they have to become effeminate. They have to lose their masculinity. If the demons can remove the ones who are capable of resisting this change, then there's going to be less defense of the ones who are innocent. Their goal is to create a new race that is counterfeit to that which God created. Jesus was incarnated from a spiritual father and a physical mother, and Satan created a counterfeit from that. Now, I've heard many anti Christian people proclaim that Mary was raped by God and other such nonsense as that. Well, that's human thinking. That's people who hate God. And I don't know how God did it, but I do know that it did not involve rape. Now, one of the possibilities of how this happened is through a process called parthenogenesis. Parthenogenesis is asexual reproduction among mammals. It's when a baby results from an unfertilized egg. It's considered to be rare in humans and usually results in miscarriage. But there's one high profile case in which a boy in 1995 had only female genes. In other words, there's no father. Well, at least there's not a father genetically. Now, some scientists speculate that as many as 1 in 200 pregnancies are a result of parthenogenesis, while other scientists say that any pregnancy is impossible. Nobody knows for sure, but either way, to track that many women for that long would be impossible, so it's only speculation on that. But I do know that it did not involve rape. Now, while Ahab served Jezebel, the priests who served Astarte under Jezebel, the priests were castrated, as well as many of the followers of Astarte. They did it voluntarily. Jezebel was a high priestess of Baal, but Baal and Astarte go hand in hand. Now, the world presents one view of Astarte. If you look up a description of Astarte, she was a goddess of love and fertility. It's always positive with these demons. The world looks at these demons positively. What kind of love is it? It's some kind of debauched love, that's for sure. Sometimes she is presented as a masculine woman, sometimes as a feminine man, sometimes as a truly beautiful woman. She's fluid, just like demons. All demons are gender fluid. Now, in pagan demonology, there is a male demon figure named Astaroth who is supposedly the demonic result or the manifestation of the goddess Astaroth or Astarte, and is associated with the evil trinity with Beelzebub and Lucifer. Now, although the physical goddess was female, this masculine demon evolved into a wicked and vengeful androgynous characterization. That means that this being is either male, female, both, or none, and can change at will. So the followers of both the masculine demon and the feminine god and the feminine goddess, they had to change. The priests were all castrated males who turned themselves into women. The first parade that is recorded in history was a huge one dedicated to this goddess, and the priests all marched at the front holding up scalpels, showing that they had changed themselves into women. Do you know what the other symbol for this being was? It was carried all throughout this parade very prominently. It was a rainbow. Satan counterfeits everything that God gives. Now, this worship took the wicked and the immoral acts that are associated with her worship and brought them out of the basements and out of the back rooms and into public prominence. And in short, this demon is the patron god, little g patron god, but he is the patron god of Pride Month. Pride is demonic, and homosexuality and all other sorts of deviancy is paraded around openly to celebrate what God calls sin. And people say, brother, you're reading too much into that. Yeah, let me tell you something. In 2023, using 3D printing technology, there's a reproduction of the Palmyra arch that was reconstructed at 2/3 size using Egyptian marble. This is the entrance into the Temple of Baal. You know where they put it? Well, it started in Trafalgar Square Trafalgar Square in London. Then they moved it to New York City at City Hill Park. The original Palmyra Arch was built by Septimus Severus as an entrance into the Temple of Baal. Originally, the people who built this reproduction had intended to recreate the actual temple itself, not just the arch. They wanted to create the whole temple. But after an uproar, they decided to build this arch, which they claimed had nothing to do with Baal worship. That was an out and out lie because it was the entrance of the temple. I mean, it had everything to do with Baal worship. The original arch was destroyed by ISIS in 2015. They're supposedly recreating this arch as a protest against religious extremism, but they're putting them up all over the world. And it may or may not be true as to why they're making it. It may just be archaeological, maybe they have bad intentions. But if it's not true, then they're simply useful idiots who are recreating evil unintentionally. Most likely they know what they're doing. Anton LaVey created the Church of Satan as a scam in order to legitimize deviancy and built people for money. He was a carny who knew showmanship, but this church that was a scam evolved into a literal Church of Satan by the followers. In other words, he had nothing to do with Satan, but it didn't take long before the church itself did. But this arch is being recreated around the world, and perhaps they're simply trying to preserve history. But the demons are going to take full advantage of that. They already have taken full advantage of that. Um, I have to admit that before that I had been shown the truth about things such as Palmyra, I would have been appalled by the destruction of archaeological sites such as this. Now I'm not so sure that it's a bad thing because this was a temple to Baal. But what do these cities where the arch is being displayed have in common? Why are they displaying it in these particular cities? Because these cities are famous for their very extravagant pride celebrations and laws that protect deviancy while criminalizing anything and everything that's decent and moral. You can be in prison for not complying with their delusional gender narratives. It's perhaps insanity, but it's definitely demonic. It may be insanity to go along with it. But the entire world is in danger of losing everything, and most of the world doesn't even know that they're at war. Now, the United States is ground zero for this, and this new iteration of the gender revolution is not new. It's just that the old gods have returned. Many, if not most people, can't define the difference between a man and a woman. They let men compete in women's sport, and it's called inclusion. Men can use the female bathrooms and the locker rooms. Everything is included in this new culture except for anything that's moral and good. Now, if you fail to participate in their delusions, you'll be ostracized, you'll be canceled, you'll be labeled as evil, and probably as a criminal. Pride Month is demonic. It started out as a homosexual parade, but now, even according to homosexual activist Brandon Straka, gay pride has been taken over by trans and pans. And I will let you look at the definitions for what transsexuals and pansexuals are. New York is where it all started, and New York is the capital. When the terrorists attacked the Great Satan in 2001, it was not because of our liberty, it was because of our debauchery and the way that we exported it around the world and forced it on other nations. Now, if you're keeping up with news in the United States, you can see the untold billions of dollars that Doge is uncovering that are being spent on these demonic things by the US government. We're promoting these things around the world. Now, this demonic movement has a slogan that you've probably heard. They say, love is love. Now, it's hard to argue with that on the surface. I mean, that sounds great. However, when you unpack what this slogan means, what happens? All they're doing is asking cis people to realize that we're all just people. That's what they say. But it's used to try to normalize deviancy. It started popping up about a decade ago, and it sounds practical. And within the church, it turned the argument into one of grace, not salvation. but it was an attempt to say that homosexual relationships should be valued and honored. Then it was used to destroy the godly institution of marriage. It was a way in which their allies, who are heterosexual people who provide legitimacy to them, but their allies tried to make the LGBTQ movement look wholesome, try to make it look good. Love is love. It's a statement that declared that authenticity determines integrity. After all, who can judge love, right? That sounds very similar to, yea, hath God said, that Satan spoke in the garden. While this phrase, love is love, seems inoffensive and benign, it's a very deceptive phrase. Just as Satan deceived Eve, he is deceiving the world. Did God really say that love is inherently good? Who defines love? God or your feelings and emotions? To paraphrase a character from a pro homosexual movie, said love is love, that's a lie, and we made it up to convince you idiots to treat us fairly. Our relationships are different. Even they tell you that that's a lie. It's deceptive to try to get you to say, hey, what you're doing is okay. The slogan Love is Love says that love stands on its own with integrity, meaning, and grace. However, 1 John 4:8 says, he that loveth not knoweth not God, for God is love. Then 1 Corinthians 13:4 through 6, this is out of the NET Bible. Love is patient, love is kind, it is not envious. Love does not brag, it's not puffed up, it's not rude, it is not self-serving, it is not easily angered or resentful. It is not glad about injustice, but rejoices in the truth. God is love. The integrity of love is not found in love itself, but it is found in its corresponding object, which is God. And if you love what God loves, then love is a moral good. 1 John 2:15 says, love not the world, neither the things that are in the world. If any man love the world, the love of the Father is not in him. So if you love God, what God loves, then it's a moral good. But if you love what God hates, then it's sin. Presenting the idea that love has integrity on its own is idolatry, and it's an abomination. It has no moral foundations because it's separated from God. And the very phrase love is love proves that the entire LGBTQ movement has rejected God in exchange for idolatrous love. Now, idolatry can simply be love of self, although it's obviously much more than that most of the time. Do you know what else the slogan love is love means? It's the exact principle behind the worship of Astarte. It's idolatrous lust. The worship of Astarte, with all the deviant rituals and celebrations, promise to bring prosperity, abundance, and blessings, most especially romantic love and relationships. And anecdotally, it's interesting just how wealthy homosexual couples tend to be when they're in a long term committed relationship. The promises of prosperity are very deceptive. But these are obvious and blatant examples of this. However, it's permeated our entire society, including the church. It's not a new thing, but it's now more widespread than ever. Men who are going to serve the Jezebel spirit have to be castrated, not literally necessarily, but metaphorically, but they have to become defiant of their God given gender roles. They will justify it with all sorts of self deception, and people are there waiting to help them deceive themselves. The ancient worship of Astarte involved the worship by men who were transgender. The priests were transgender. They dressed as women, they wore makeup, they had female hairstyles, they cut off their genitals. They were drag queens singing and dancing in public for family friendly drag shows, and on and on and on down the list. And sometimes I wonder if there were any that were like the modern variety that actually wore beards and shaved their heads along with it. But we read where Josephus and other ancient writers wrote about these people, the makeup, they tried to make themselves as much like women as possible. Ecclesiastes 1:9 says, the thing that hath been, it is that which shall be, and that which is done is that which shall be done, and there is no new thing under the sun. Ecclesiastes is a book that we often ignore, but we can learn much from it. What we see going on in the world today is not something new, but it's the return of something old. The old gods have returned, and people are embracing them, and they're embracing their worship wholeheartedly. There are some within the LGBTQ community, they'll admit this, they'll often brag about it. But most, both within and without that community, are completely blind to it. They don't even see it, even within the church. Galatians chapter 3, verse 1, Paul's writing says, O foolish Galatians, who hath bewitched you that you should not obey the truth, before whose eyes Jesus Christ hath been evidently set forth, crucified among you? This word bewitched is used in the Septuagint to mean someone has cast the evil eye upon someone. Someone has cast an evil spell upon you, is what this is saying. This is a demonic spirit. It's confusion. And he goes on in chapter 5 to warn against legalism. Verse 2 says, Behold, I, Paul, say unto you that if you be circumcised, Christ shall profit you nothing. Now, this is not teaching against the act of circumcision itself, but it's teaching against the legalism of it. It's not sinful in and of itself to be circumcised, but when it's done to fulfill the law, then it's sinful. Verse 3, For I testify again to every man that is circumcised that he is a debtor to the whole law. When you put yourself under the law, you're no longer under grace. Then verses 12 through 14, I would they were cut off even I would they were even cut off which trouble you. For brethren, you have been called unto liberty. Only use not liberty for an occasion of the flesh, but by love serve one another. For all the law is fulfilled in one word, even this, thou shalt love thy neighbor as itself. The King James Version doesn't give this passage its full impact. The NET Bible in verse 12 says, I wish those agitators would go so far as to castrate themselves. It's not quite as family friendly that way, but that's what it says. If they're going to demand circumcision to fulfill the law, why not go all the way and be just like the pagan priests? Finish the job. This entire church was being infiltrated by Jezebelians. Are there people today in the church who demand legalism? Do you see that? Perhaps they demand it in order to prove that you're truly saved. And you may say, well, if you're really and truly saved, then you won't sin, and fulfilling the law is proof of that. Or they may use a different reason to promote legalism. But the end of the law, or the entire definition of the law, is to love the Lord your God and to love your neighbor as yourself. That does not require legalism. That requires grace and faithfulness. Now, these false priests who served Astarte by whatever name she was going by, whether Diana, Ashtaroth, Inanna, whatever, they were all emasculated. They were effeminate. They wore feminine hairstyles. They dressed in women's clothing. They wore makeup. They were wimpy. They called upon their goddess to fulfill them with an unholy spirit. We see that today. And in the churches, we have the Ahab men all making it possible, or the Ahab spirit. The Ahab spirit sometimes manifests in women, but it's usually men. But it's the Ahab spirit that makes it all possible. They raise money for charity to help these poor, downtrodden women. Remember, we can't define what a woman is, but they make it possible for them to live their unholy lifestyles. And your children are being fed a diet of this false teaching. When they're in school, when they're away, they're being fed this constantly. Last week, we looked at the female pastor, I use that term loosely, who praised the Jezebel spirit. And we also looked at that false bishop who was given an international platform from which to preach her heresy. And it turns out that she was given millions of taxpayer dollars in order to promote this heresy. So she had a financial motivation. Does she truly believe her heresies, or is it just for financial gain? Only she and God knows. But it was pure heresy. But if your child goes to church with one of their school friends, your child might hear this perverted version of the Lord's Prayer. This is literally taken from their website, and this is preached around the churches around the world. This, I apologize in advance. It's kind of disgusting. But it says, Our mother and our father, our beloved parent, in whom we move and breathe and have our being. The glorious hallowing of your name shines forth in the diversity of your children. May your peace and love, justice and equality, inclusion and belonging reign here on earth as in heaven. Build your kingdom in the hearts of all. Help us meet our daily needs. Be with those who suffer as a result of living as the fullest truth of your divine child. Grant that our transgender loved ones might have their daily needs met, that they might find employment without discrimination, that they may have access to medical care without fear, that they might have their rights and lives protected, that they might find a loving, safe community to belong to and call their own. Forgive us for the ways that we have fallen short and failed your beloved transgender children, as well as our many trespasses. Forgive us of the times we turned away or did not care, for the times we laughed or judged their unique expression of your image, just as we forgive those who might have failed to see, hear, and understand us. Lead us away from the temptation to be complacent in the face of injustice, but instead give us the courage to stand up for and with your beloved children. Open our minds and our hearts to those who think, act, and experience life differently. Help us to do our part to make your love and justice reign in our diverse, beautiful world, now and always. Amen. And yes, that prayer, they call it their version of the Lord's Prayer, but it is being preached from the pulpits of countless churches every week. They always target the children, and these transgender demons are seducing the world. In Western culture and Western civilization, sexuality was seen as a sacred domain of marriage up until about the middle of the 20th century. And people always made poor choices and violated those norms, but everyone still knew what the norms were. The norms were moral. They were part of a lifelong covenant between a man and a woman, and it had been that way for thousands of years. Anything else was seen as sin, even by those who were committing the sin. They knew it was a sin. Divorce was frowned upon, and so it was rare and generally only in the direst of circumstances. If a woman became pregnant out of wedlock, the couple was expected to marry because that family is the foundation of civilization, and raising that children was the foundation of the family. Single motherhood was rare, it happened, but it was rare, except in the case of the death of the father. And once again, this is not condemnation for any past behavior. The past cannot be undone, but it's a call for repentance for the future. Prostitution existed, but it was illegal, so it was kept out of the mainstream. It's the same with pornography. It existed, but it was kept out of the mainstream. And those who violated the standards kept it private, at least for the most part. Entertainment and popular culture was expected to maintain the same standards. If a baseball player's activities were scandalous, they were kept out of the limelight and were not held up as role models. They still got to play, but they didn't get a lot of airtime. Today, no matter how bad an athlete's behavior, they're held up as an idol to be emulated. Movies and TV shows at the time did not portray sexual activity on the screen at all, and any illicit sexual activity was always presented in a negative light. Even married couples slept in different beds. They weren't really married in real life, they were just actors and actresses. Now, culturally, many married couples did sleep in separate beds for various reasons, but usually it was for so called health reasons. Doctors presented the idea that sleeping separately helped prevent the spread of disease and increase sleep quality. But the reasons it was portrayed that way in movies and TVs was because it was scandalous to directly imply sexual activity in any form. And all nudity was forbidden once movie codes were established. But then came the deification of sex. And there's a saying that no one knows the original origin from it, but it says that if you believe in nothing, you will fall for anything. That's where humanism has gotten us. When an individual or a group moves away from God, that which is not God will become God. Self can be a God, or in this case, sex can be a God. When Israel turned away from God, sex was deified. The Star Day worship was popular. Sex became an end and a goal to be pursued for itself. Sex was separated from any context, especially away from marriage. Now, when this spirit came to the United States, it was nothing new. For good or bad, the United States was the beacon of the world, but the old gods had returned. In Matthew 5:15 says, "Neither do men light a candle and put it under a bushel, but they put it on a candlestick or a lampstand, and it gives light unto all that are in the house." Men are going to put their light on a lampstand. That light may or may not be good. It's just as salt in the previous verses may or may not be good salt. Now, the implication is that it's supposed to be good. You're supposed to present a good light, but it may not be a good light, and you're still going to put that light up there for the world to see, even if it's a bad light. The United States had a good light for the most part for a long time, but things changed just after the middle of the 20th century. Sex was deified and became an end in itself. And what should be the exclusive domain of husband and wife spilled over into public culture. Sex was separated completely from marriage, and the culture became very hedonistic. And just as Israel served the goddess of sexuality, now the United States led the world to worship sex. The United States became indwelt by the goddess and was seduced, and through them the entire world was seduced. Sex, which God had created for the pleasure of people within the bonds of marriage, had become a god that enslaved millions. We mentioned Anton LaVey earlier. When he founded the Church of Satan, he did so as a means to legitimize this hedonistic behavior. It was important to him to have friends who were celebrities, and the celebrities flocked to him because now they were being told that their sin was okay. Those who flocked to him were household names that they kind of tried to keep this quiet, but names like Jane Mansfield, the Rolling Stones, Sammy Davis Jr., and Liberace. Now, this doesn't take into account those who flocked to Aleister Crowley, who is possibly worse than Anton LaVey, and those are people such as the Beatles and Jimmy Page. And Jimmy Page is also interested in the Golden Dawn, which is the pagan religion of the Nazis. And there are many others who participated in other forms of the occult. And not everyone who is successful in entertainment is evil, but it does seem as if many have sold their souls, so to speak, in order to become famous. But this was all part of the deification of sex and distancing themselves from God. The slogan of the 70s was, "If it feels good, do it." If people call it sin, then call them intolerant and get laws passed against them. In fact, perhaps we should subsidize bad behavior with tax dollars in order to get more of it. Now, although many of the rituals that surrounded Astarte worship involved ritual marriage, that marriage was marriage in name only, sort of like the modern idea of marriage in the secular world. There is nothing that is conducive to marriage in this worship. In fact, it's all destructive to marriage, or at least destructive to true marriage. Before I will perform a marriage ceremony, I do require some premarital counseling. And the first question I ask is, well, why do you want to get married? And the answer, of course, is always, well, because we love each other. And I say, yeah, we know that, but why do you want to get married? It makes them think there has to be more to it than that. A godly marriage involves much more than that. And it's good to love each other, but a commitment to a godly lifestyle with common goals is more important. If you have those things, then a true and deep love will develop, even if it's not there already. Hopefully, it's there already. But Astarte was promiscuous. She was never faithful. She was always pursuing another lover. The acts involved in her worship always undermined true marriage. Her return was demonstrated by an undermining and a weakening of marriage. Sex was glorified for itself, and marriage was eroded. Just as she was promiscuous, so the world followed suit. Divorce became more acceptable, so since it was acceptable, it became rampant because it's always easier to quit. When there were problems, they wouldn't fix a marriage. They wouldn't even try to fix a marriage. And so it was destroyed. Broken homes led to extreme poverty, and it led to increased crime, which harmed the entire culture. But as divorce became acceptable, so did sex outside of marriage. As sex outside of marriage became acceptable, so did out of wedlock births in single parent households. And using tax dollars, the government helped to incentivize this. They wanted more of it. Now, remember Ephesians 6:12, I'm not going to put it up here, but it tells us that the government's the problem because the government is controlled by the demonic. Now, that's obviously not all politicians are demonic, but it's the cumulative effect. There are enough who are that it's the problem. Astarte's only guidance in life was her will and desires. And Jezebel exhibited this perfectly in the past and will do so again in the future. Or doing so she's doing it now. Just as she didn't care about the consequences of her actions, so too modern society doesn't care about the consequences. In fact, modern society will double down on it and will condemn anyone who speaks out against it. I am personally aware of cases of Sweden, Canada, and the United States in which people were arrested because they simply spoke out against immorality. The one in Sweden was actually speaking against that immorality from the pulpit, wasn't even in the street. They were in the church listening to his sermon and arrested him. Now, instant gratification of every desire is the only thing that is important, and denying one's desire is denigrated and called impractical by those who want to justify this bad behavior. Desires became more important than relationships, and today fewer and fewer people are getting married in the first place. And why is that? Jezebel, or the spirit of Jezebel. Her reach was limited, however. It takes a long time to reach one person at a time. So the entertainment industry followed the course of the rest of the world. Gone were all the restraints, all standards were removed, and what was once forbidden was now in theaters everywhere. And not just the hidden theaters in the back rooms, but the mainstream theaters. TV, which once wouldn't have even shown a married couple in bed together, began showing anyone and everyone in bed together, sometimes all at the same time, and not simply implying what was going on, but showing it. Nudity, which was never shown in public, was now shown in every theater and in every living room. It was a dystopian future that those in the past had feared, but it was now reality. So the platform to spread this religion had been expanded and it was popular and it's exciting. There were no more boundaries, there were no more taboos, and actually, there were boundaries set up that you could no longer call immoral behavior what it was. The Jezebel spirit, the Astarte spirit, it's a spirit of lawlessness, and it was, and it still is, rampant in the world today. It's all about physical pleasure. But the reality is that it's a desecration and a defilement of all that's holy. Sexual immorality has become sanctified. Sexual immorality and perversion is now sacred just as it was in the ancient past in ancient Israel in worship of this false goddess. And now the moral restraints are what is forbidden. They're called repressive. If you try to point out immorality, don't repress me. If an individual fails to deify the immorality, they're considered a heretic in this new humanist religion. Being opposed to deviancy is considered blasphemous and it'll get you stoned. Figuratively, at least so far, it's only figurative stoning. But the false gods want to turn civilization upside down, and they're succeeding. Partly because so few people understand that we're at war. The New World religion took what was forbidden and made it mainstream religious rituals. It shocked people at first, but people became numb to it. The world preached tolerance, but expected not only acceptance, but even celebration of deviancies. And those who didn't become numb, they became cynical, and cynics are the only ones who are keeping the battle alive. Cynicism is not a bad thing sometimes. But godly sexuality creates a strong marriage, and a strong marriage creates a sound society and a culture. And our society and culture is falling apart. It all started with the falling apart of godly morals. Although it started much earlier, it came to a head in the hedonistic, drug-fueled 60s. The verse says, it's pharmakia that we talked about before, sorcery. The 70s were the hangover in which the trend continued downward, and we were paying the price because God was giving us a warning, but we didn't listen to the lesson. The Jezebel spirit had worked a transformation on the world, and it was not a good transformation. The things that led to a great civilization had all but been erased, and life itself had been altered. And none of it was new. It was the old gods returned. And how does that bode for the future? Well, we have to look to the past again. When Ahab married Jezebel, she was young, she was hot, she was beautiful, and she was pure evil. Now, the fact that she was young and hot and beautiful may have blinded him to the part of her being evil, but the Bible tells us in 1 Kings 16:30 that Ahab did evil above all that were before him. So he may have found the evil to be appealing as well. She came from a long line of demonic people, and as such, she seduced Israel into worshiping the false gods. She didn't try to destroy the worship of Yahweh, at least not at first. But she tried to move them together and water down true Yahweh worship until it was unrecognizable. And we see that in the churches today. I'm not worried about the world. Well, I'm worried about the world, but I'm more worried about the churches. No one wants to offend anyone because their jobs depend on filling the pews. And sadly, many seminaries and Bible colleges actually teach how to do this. They want numbers of people more than they want to teach the truth about God. The truth is offensive, so they obscure it to the point that it can no longer be recognized. We have looked at some of them in the past when we were looking at doctrines of demons, but they're very pervasive. One of the most popular is using the reader response method, and simply put, that means that the reader's reaction to the text is more important than what the text actually says. In other words, you can make it say anything that you want it to say. And that is a method that they are actually teaching preachers to use. In order to fill the pews, the church leaders will approve of any sin through twisting the scriptures, and sometimes simply by ignoring the studies or by ignoring the scriptures. And I'll do a short study on reader response method in the tidbit section of the channel in the near future, but that brief definition works for right now. But what is this leading the world to? Jude 1:7 says, even as Sodom and Gomorrah and the cities about them in like manner, giving themselves over to fornication and going after strange flesh, are set forth for an example, suffering the vengeance of eternal fire. This is leading to destruction. People know why Sodom and Gomorrah were destroyed, or at least they think they do. They get the sanitized, family-friendly version of the story. But Ezekiel 16, verses 49 through 50 says, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me. Therefore, I removed them when I saw it. It's interesting that the iniquity of Sodom doesn't even mention the sexual sins. It does say they were full of pride, and that pride is arrogance or pomp. The Moabites, they were proud and they were destroyed for it. God searches the heart, both of individuals and of people groups, such as nations as a whole. And it's important to remember that in this world, you may suffer for the actions of others, even if your heart is pure. Well, do you see arrogance and pomp in the world today? Maybe in the form of pride and parades? But it says they had fullness of bread. They had an excess of food. They didn't have to work for it. When I was growing up, I spent a lot of time on farms, and I can tell you that's hard work. I didn't like it. Honestly, I prefer doing the work that I do now and going down to the grocery store and giving them my money and buying the food that I want. There's plenty of it. But I do understand hard work. Today, many of our young people don't even know how to work at all, much less do hard work. They don't know how to fill out a job application. They don't know how to get up on time. They don't know how to dress appropriately. They don't know how to show up to do a job. And that's the world we live in. They fail to launch. That's what this verse is talking about. This is the kind of people. They have an abundance of idleness. It's a prosperous ease. And if they choose not to work, there's a government program that will give them everything they need. They have plenty of time on their hands to cause mischief. It may not be luxuriant living, but it's easy. They're lazy when it comes to everything except for causing trouble. And it says they didn't strengthen the hands of the poor and needy. They didn't help them. Today we have government schemes to help the poor, but these programs only help keep them poor. And if the poor do manage to get out of poverty, there are government schemes that were going to punish them for it. It also says that they were haughty, and this means that they were puffed up with prosperity. There's nothing wrong with being prosperous. There's nothing wrong with having nice things. There's nothing wrong with having nicer things than someone else has. However, there may be something wrong with your attitude about them. If your attitude is you're a peasant, my house is bigger than yours, that's a problem. But it also says that they did abominable things. It says they committed abomination before me. Everyone knows the sexual sins that were committed by the people there, but this word abomination is a Hebrew idiom for idolatry. Colossians 3:5 says, Mortify therefore your members which are upon the earth, fornication, uncleanness, inordinate affection, evil concupiscence, and covetousness, which is idolatry. Covetousness or greed is wanting to have more than what you're due. You might have the biggest house, the nicest car, or the perfect wife, and it's not greed. But to want what someone else has that you don't rightly own, that is greed. That is covetousness. It's avarice. It's an inordinate desire for gain. And socialism as a political structure at its root is pure covetousness or greed. And elsewhere in the Bible, there are catalogs of sins which we mostly ignore. But this is a big one. This isn't on the list. This is covetousness, is idolatry. But it says that Sodom was full of luxuries. The people were prosperous and idle. There's a saying that says an idle mind is the devil's workshop. When it says that they didn't help out the poor and needy, it doesn't mean that they didn't simply forcefully redistribute money to the poor. There's no place in the Bible that even remotely hints at that idea. But it was through greed and injustice that they created an atmosphere in which the poor and needy were oppressed. And there's a story in which a man was hit in the head with a rock, and the person who hit him took him to court and to charge him for the medical procedure of bleeding. The judge agreed with him and told the man who had been hit that he had to pay. And so that man took a rock out of his pocket and hit the judge in the head with it and said, Now, you owe me, so you pay him. And whether that story is true or not, it does represent the society in Sodom in that day. And unfortunately, it's beginning to resemble our society today, in which all sorts of outrageous rulings are being made on a daily basis. But not only did they not help the poor, they went so far as to make it illegal to help others. Now, this is the part that's omitted from the Bible. And it's omitted because it was part of the culture, it was part of their society around them that everyone knew. So there was no point in repeating it, putting it in the Bible. We don't know that history. Most people don't even know the modern history of the world around them right now. They don't care, much less the history around the time that Sodom was destroyed. But in Sodom at that time, they had great festivals in which wife swapping was obligatory. And it might not be swapping for another woman, even. But they had laws against helping the poor. If a stranger came to town, it was illegal to help them. And if you were caught helping them, you would be punished, perhaps even executed. And there are many stories from Sodom in which they derived great pleasure from watching impoverished people starve to death because they weren't permitted to leave and nobody was permitted to help them. It was all sport. So the nature of the collective sins of Sodom and Gomorrah are generally presumed to be referring to homosexuality, but that is completely missing the point of the narrative. The sins are of a cultural lawlessness that is rooted in the brokenness of the marriage contract of the family of one man and one woman for a lifetime. The term sodomite often refers to the male shrine prostitutes, and the Greek term derives from dogs and heat without control. And even Jesus uses similar language to that in Revelation 22, verses 14 to 15. It said, "Blessed are they that do his commandments, that they may have right to the tree of life and may enter in through the gates into the city. For without, outside the gates, are dogs, kunes, same word that we're looking at for the sodomites here. But for without are dogs and sorcerers. This is pharmakia. They're druggers. They're drug dealers. And whoremongers. These are fornicators. This from the word pornos, from which we get pornography. So all these things are without the gate, and murderers and idolaters, and whosoever loveth and maketh a lie." What would Jesus do? He would speak the truth, even if that means calling somebody names. The sins of Sodom are not what we call sodomy today. It's in the nature of pansexuality, which means that if you want to get it on with anybody and everybody. I told you earlier that you would have to look up what pansexual means, but now you don't have to. I did it for you anyway. But it's in the nature, not the act itself. In the strictest sense, sodomy, outside of the references to Sodom itself, has to be forced homosexual intercourse, but that's a different discussion entirely. We're looking at Sodom right now. But it's always used in a sense of a grievous sin or wickedness that goes against hospitality. In a broad sense, it would cover adultery and prostitution, although those are specific sins. But sodomy is lawlessness, and in the case of Sodom, it was done publicly. Now, have you watched TV or movies lately? It's all done publicly. It's not private at all. It involves idolatry, and it forsakes the one true God. And the term sodomy is used to describe the pagan culture that's come to full fruition, which was usually literal sodomy, but always figurative sodomy. And it led to a breakdown of the family and social structure. And it always promised security, but it led to destruction. And this idea is central to the story of Lot and his family. And most importantly, perhaps, sodomy seeks cultural approval. It doesn't want to remain hidden. It likes parades. It always has. And once it becomes acceptable, then it seeks to infiltrate and take over the true worship of the community by replacing the worship of Yahweh. Historically, the pagan prophets and priests in Israel were inside the temple. This spirit opposes anything that is godly and moral. One day, we're told that sodomites will have their part destroyed in the lake of fire. And until then, it represents social lawlessness. There's nothing new under the sun. This is the return of the old gods. Astarte worship thrived in Sodom and Gomorrah until they were destroyed. This is entirely the Jezebel spirit. To repeat Ezekiel 16:49 through 50, this was the guilt of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters had pride, excess of food, and prosperous ease, but did not aid the poor and needy. They were haughty and did abominable things before me, therefore I removed them when I saw it. What's missing in this list? Homosexuality is not even mentioned. Does that mean that homosexuality is not a sin? Of course it's a sin. But the sins that are listed here are national sins. Homosexuality is a personal sin. Embracing homosexuality or embracing any sin of any sort for that matter, that would be a national sin. But the act itself is a personal sin. Once again, the past cannot be undone, but you can repent going forward. And for the sins that are listed, and they are sins, Sodom is destroyed. Do you see these things going on in the world around you? I'll tell you a secret. When you read the Bible, you find out that what's going on is going to get much worse. And in closing tonight, I want us to look at one last thing. In the Apocrypha, there are two books, First Esdras and Second Esdras. Modern translations, such as the King James Version, and later mostly use the naming and numbering conventions of the Latin Vulgate. Modern scholars generally use the term Ezra in order to avoid confusion with the Greek, which has six Esdras. But there is some doubt about whether or not Ezra wrote all of them. We know that he wrote the one. Now, they were all originally written in Hebrew, but other than Ezra and Nehemiah, all we have are Hebrew fragments plus some Greek translations. Now, there's no such thing as a perfect translation, but that's what we have. We have the Greek translations from the Hebrew. I want us to look at one passage that is relevant to our discussion today. Now, it's not scripture, but it is commentary on scripture. They were included in the original King James Version, so I'm using that translation here, although the Revised Standard Version is easier to understand and Lexham's translation is also good. But in 2nd Esdras chapter 2, verses 8 through 9 from the King James Version, woe be unto thee, Asher, thou that hidest the unrighteous in thee. O thou wicked people, remember what I did unto Sodom and Gomorrah, whose land lieth in clods of pitch and heaps of ashes. Even so also will I do unto them that hear me not, saith the Almighty Lord. Well, Asher here is Assyria. Assyria took the northern kingdom of Israel into exile. Assyria was the greatest nation on earth at that time, and it was a brutal military dictatorship. But it was destroyed about the 7th century BC by a coalition of smaller kingdoms as soon as Assyria showed any signs of weakness. Now, Nahum prophesied the destruction of the capital, Nineveh. This destruction was about 2 centuries after Jonah went there. They repented when Jonah was there, but they backslid pretty bad. It didn't take them that long to revert to their old ways even. It was pretty quick. I think it took about 135 years before they were back to the way they were. But we know that one day the Assyrian will return, the Antichrist. That's what he's called in the Bible, the Assyrian. It's the return of Baal. Baal and Astarte always go together. One day they will return together, or they've already returned, and they're on the scene. They're just waiting now to seize full power. Ezekiel 31:3, behold, the Assyrian was a cedar in Lebanon, with fair branches, and with a shadowing shroud, and of a high structure, and his top was among the thick boughs. A few verses later, we're told that he was in the Garden of Eden, and he was the tallest and strongest tree. The birds loved this tree over all the other trees, and the other trees became jealous. In the Bible, trees represent governmental structures, whether secular government or church government. Birds always represent the leaders. Parables don't have to use literal imagery as long as you know what the imagery represents. And the Bible tells us that. You just have to dig a little bit to find this imagery. If you read the Epistle of Barnabas, he served with Paul, and he wrote down what some of this imagery means. He was a very prominent disciple in Jerusalem at the time, but you can dig it out of the Bible. You have to read a little here and a little there. But we know what these things represent. In 2nd Ezra chapter 5, verses 6 through 7, and even he shall rule, whom they look not for that dwell upon the earth, and the fowls, the birds, shall take their flight away together. And the Sodomitish sea, the Sodom sea will cast out fish, and make a noise in the night, which many have not known, but they shall all hear the voice thereof. In the imagery of the parables in the New Testament, in the book of Matthew specifically, the fish represent individuals out of the sea of humanity. And here it says the Sodom sea will cast out fish. In other words, the fish, the birds are trying to attract the fish out of the sea. And in this case, they're taken out of the Sodom sea, and they're part of the corrupt empire of the church. That's who the birds are. The birds represent the empire of the corrupt church, and they'll take anybody and everybody. They will take these sodomites that have been condemned in order to make their church bigger and more powerful. But they're all cast out and they run away. And I'm going to post a link to the entire passage in the comments below so that you can read it yourself later. We're not going to read the entire passage. But this represents chaos. This is the church that has been subverted by the forces of evil. Do we see these things going on in the church today? Building empires instead of building disciples? Welcoming perversion for financial gain? Ignoring God's words in order to promote lawlessness? Jezebel's back. Baal's back. Baal and Astarte worship are in full motion. Look around you and you'll see it everywhere. You have to preach and teach to others. But if they will not listen, you move on and preach and teach to somebody who will accept you. Matthew 10, verses 14 through 15 says, "And whosoever shall not receive you nor hear your words, when you depart out of that house or city, shake off the dust of your feet. Verily I say unto you, it shall be more tolerable for the land of Sodom and Gomorrah in the day of judgment than for that city." You have to inspect yourself, and you have to warn your neighbors and your families. Don't be seduced. You have to pray. You have to pray hard, and you have to study hard. And remember, even Jesus didn't pray for the world, but pray for yourself. Pray for me. Pray for your neighbors and pray for the peace of Jerusalem. Amen.